So we would like to invite here our panelists. First panelist, Professor Pouria ASKARY. And Professor Rania ALZRAIR, she's already here. And Professor Moshen, please join us. And Professor Laura SAYAH, she will be online. She's already. And even though it's a little bit late, because we extended on the sake of discussion, the session, previously session, Asia Century challenged us, especially from our side, from European side, to start to understand better what means Asia or West Asia, Western Asia. Now we are moving towards certain thoughts or opinions related to the economy and environmental perspective from that region. We'd like to start with the first our panelist, Professor Pouria ASKARY. I would like also to thank you that you are here for the first time in Romania. He is a professor at Allameh Tabatabaei University, expert in international law. Professor, the floor is yours.
Everyone. Thank you so much, Mr. CABA-MARIA. As Mr. Moderator, our chair, my friend, has already mentioned, my name is Pouria ASKARY. I am a lawyer and university professor of international law from Iran. And of course, it is a great pleasure and honor for me to be present in this very prestigious conference and in this very beautiful country. So first and foremost, I have to thank the organizers and especially the MEPEI and also the Iranian embassy in Romania and especially His Excellency Dr. Sadat Meidani for their very kind invitation. Well, I know that we are all exhausted. It was a long, long day talking about what is going on in the Middle East, but there are still 2 panels to go. So as panelists of the last panels, the only thing that we can do to make sure that everyone will remember there was a beautiful and nice Iranian cuisine for lunch is to be short. So I will do my best, and I will try to be really short. Well, when I got the invitation to participate in this conference, when I was thinking of the topic of the conference that you can see here, Middle East in quest for security, stability, and economic identity, I was asking myself, well, as an international lawyer, what do you want to talk about, which is a bit linked to what is going on in this quest, which is going on in the Middle East? And I thought, well, maybe in Europe, you are now too much busy with new problems, including the Russia-Ukraine war and all the other issues. So maybe it's not bad to recall that there is still one very important and major crisis going on in the Middle East with lots of international aspects. That is terrorism and groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh, which still exist in the Middle East region and are actually part of the challenges that we are facing to reach kind of stabilize the region and stabilize the situation. So I thought maybe I can talk about this to also have a touch with international relations area and diplomatic corps who are present in this room. And for that, I was looking at the results of the counterterrorism measures that actually many Middle East countries took to fight against terrorism, at least since 9/11. And the result is not that much acceptable. So this came to my mind that maybe I can talk with you about this question, which is actually part of a bigger research that I'm doing nowadays on counterterrorism measures in different countries and how it is actually impact the humanitarian assistance that is needed. So the question that I want to raise in this point is, how come with all of these measures that we took in Middle East, at the end of the day, after almost 20 years, when we look back and see the scene of the Middle East, there are still many terrorist groups doing different activities. And we can say that the success is a minimum. Well, to be short, I start to give you some facts that more or less everyone is familiar with. Well, the first is the people of Middle East in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in many other contexts are seriously suffering nowadays from terrorism and terrorist activities. And this is something that we should not forget. The terrorism is still super active in this part of the planet Earth. The second fact that is important to be mentioned is most of the Middle Eastern states and countries contributed a lot to counterterrorism measures and anti-terrorism activities, and let's say the so-called war against terrorism. But still, terrorist is active there. The third point is, apart from international activities that all the MENA countries did, each and every of them have adopted legislations and lots of counterterrorism measures in national level to counter terrorism. They have criminalized many kinds of activities that from this way or the other way, they can link it to terrorism or supporting terrorism. So this means that they did what they could do in different parts of the region. Apart from that, we had some regime changes in the region since 2001. Just think of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and the fights which are still going on in Syria and other parts of the region. And of course, we should not forget what we called Arab Spring and all the activities that actually the Arab people did to change their regimes. All of this happened, but the result is the situation is not improving. So the question is, why we are in this status quo? Why we are in this situation? Why the situation is not better after all? Well, I can say we can talk about two different kinds of reasons. The first, I would say, let's be focused on the regional reasons that exist in the MENA region. Well, I think there are 3 points or maybe 4 that we have to concentrate on them, and I just list them. The first is, to be honest, in the Middle East region, regional cooperation is not systematic enough. Of course, we have Arab states working together, some other states working together, Iran working with some other states, but you never can find a regional, serious, concrete cooperation going on between all the Middle Eastern countries. The second reason is, unfortunately, there are lots of proxy wars going on that actually no one knows who are the parties of this armed conflict. But we can see that proxies are everywhere and they are seriously active. And so there are some groups that for the other side of the conflict, they call them terrorists. And it depends on their propaganda that how they can internationalize this view and this point of thinking. And the third disappointing reason, when you go into the details of the counterterrorism legislations which are adopted by MENA region states, you can see that most of these counterterrorism legislations have defined terrorism in a very wide way to make sure that the law is also encompassing all the opposition groups, all the journalists, all the lawyers, or the NGO activists who are trying to say something which is not that much pleasant for the governing party or those who are administrating the country. So this means that most of the MENA state countries are actually misusing these legislations against their opponents. And last, but of course not least, when we are talking about countries who are suffering from different types of crisis, including armed conflicts, of course we should not forget that lack of resources does exist as a serious obstacle in these countries. So these are the main reasons that I can say that in the MENA region, the activities that the countries did could not reach to an acceptable solution for the terrorism issue. But this is the small answer. The big answer is what internationally we did to counter terrorism. We all remember the 9/11 and afterwards. The decision by the international community to do something, to fight terrorism, to combat terrorism, to eliminate the safe haven of terrorist groups. This we all remember very well. And because of this, since 2001, we have a big number of United Nations Security Council resolutions against terrorism, which is in fact giving different types of green light to the members of the international community to do whatever you can do to eliminate terrorism. And the understanding of the world powers, of the great powers, was, okay, now we have the green light from the Security Council, so we are going to bomb the terrorism wherever they are. Foreign intervention in different parts of the region because of a good reason, that we want to fight terrorism. But we decided to fight an idea, a concept, with bombing it. Is it possible? Well, maybe after 20 years, with all of the changes, we have a very clear answer for that. The thing is, neither the Security Council nor the international community really thought of the roots of the problem. We just decided to bomb the terrorism and to impose sanctions after sanctions on terrorist groups and those who, in the mind of the drafters of the resolutions of the Security Council, are states sponsoring terrorism. So this is also a reason. This is also part of the problem. To conclude, for me, as an international lawyer, of course, I cannot talk about all the dimensions. But if you ask me, okay, now you have raised this question, what is the answer from your side? I would say, if we look at the international law, generally speaking, of course, there are lots of obligations related to counterterrorism measures, including the Security Council resolutions I have already mentioned. But this is not the whole story. International law also obliges states to go to the root causes and to find deep solutions for a big problem. When we bombed Daesh, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda, and they still exist, this means that we need to think twice if the solution works or not. And now, after 20 years since 9/11, we can see that, well, the root causes are the poverty, are the less developed countries in the region, are no respect for human rights or the human beings living there in this part of the world. The reason is not caring enough of prohibition of using force against other countries, non-intervention principle, and the other principles, which are enshrined in different treaties and conventions that all the states who are fighting against terrorism have adopted. So, as the last sentence, I just want to quote the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations Human Rights Council on Terrorism and Human Rights. She keeps saying that we need a new way if we really want to fight against terrorism. And that is to push for development from one side and from the other side, rule of law. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pouria. So now we'd like to introduce Professor Rania ALZRAIR. She is a Vice President of AL-Sham Private University and also the Dean of the Faculty of Administrative Science from the same university. Professor, you have the floor, please. I would like to mention that Professor is going to speak in Arabic, so maybe you need some of you, maybe you need the headset.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First, I would like to extend my thanks to Dr. Flavius CABA-MARIA for inviting me to this distinguished conference. Dear attendants, I will be giving my speech in Arabic. أردت اليوم أن أتحدث عن العقوبات الاقتصادية على سوريا. لماذا؟ لأن هذه العقوبات تعيق تحقيق السلام والاستقرار وتحديد الهوية الاقتصادية في سوريا. أما على مستوى المنطقة، وعلى الرغم من أن هذه العقوبات وكذلك الحرب كان لها آثار إيجابية غير مقصودة على بعض دول المنطقة كتدفق رؤوس الأموال السورية ورؤوس الأموال الفكرية إلى بعض الدول، إلا أنه حتماً ستكون الآثار الإجمالية النهائية لها مؤذية على مستوى التكامل الإقليمي في المنطقة ككل. في سوريا كافح الشعب السوري من أجل البقاء والاستمرار وسط أنقاض حرب فرضت عليه تحت غطاء ما يسمى حروب تغيير الأنظمة، وهو يواجه الآن ما أسمته الإدارة الأمريكية والاتحاد الأوروبي العقوبات. هذه العقوبات تنتهك حقوق الإنسان للشعب السوري الذي كانت بلاده ولا تزال تعاني نتائج صراع امتد لأكثر من 11 عام. خلفت الحرب أثراً رهيباً على قدرة الشعب السوري في الحصول على الحاجات الأساسية، ودمرت بشكل هائل البيوت والوحدات الطبية، منشآت البنية التحتية وغير ذلك من المرافق الحيوية في البلاد. في الوقت الذي بدأ به الشعب السوري يستعيد عافيته، طبعاً بعد الأمن والاستقرار في الأماكن التي تسيطر عليها الدولة، فرض قانون قيصر. قانون قيصر فرض سلسلة من العقوبات على نطاق واسع في كافة المجالات. هذا القانون لم يسبق أن فرض من قبل على بلد كما فرض على سوريا بهذا الشكل. هذا النطاق الواسع لقانون العقوبات الأمريكية والأوروبية الذي دخل حيز التنفيذ في حزيران، للأسف قد يستهدف أي أجنبي يساعد في عملية التعافي، أو حتى موظفي الجهات الإنسانية الأجنبية التي تساعد في إعادة بناء سوريا. ما يسمى بالعقوبات المفروضة بموجب هذا القانون أدت إلى تفاقم الوضع الإنساني الصعب بالفعل في سوريا، وخاصة في سياق جائحة كوفيد-19، كما أدى لتعريض الشعب السوري إلى مخاطر كبيرة، أهمها الفقر، البطالة، انتشار العنف والجريمة وبشكل خاص بين الشباب. عندما أعلنت الولايات المتحدة أولى العقوبات بموجب القانون، لم تقصد أن تلحق هذه العقوبات الضرر بالشعب السوري وتسيء بالوضع الإنساني. في الواقع إن تطبيق هذا القانون قد زاد الأزمة الإنسانية القائمة سوءاً، وحرم السوريين من فرصة إعادة بناء بنيتهم الأساسية المهمة. سأورد بعض الأمثلة. إن قيام وزارة الخزانة الأمريكية بمعاقبة البنك المركزي السوري للاشتباه به في عملية غسيل الأموال أو لاتهامه في القيام بعمليات غسل الأموال يخلق بشكل واضح عقبات غير ضرورية أمام التعاملات اللازمة لوصول المساعدات الأجنبية لسوريا. هذا من ناحية. من ناحية أخرى أيضاً شكلت عائق لاستيراد مستلزمات الإنتاج والمواد الأولية اللازمة في عمليات التصنيع، وفي استيراد الحاجات الأساسية الغير منتجة محلياً. أقول قد تكون هذه النتائج غير المقصودة للعقوبات الأحادية حالة دون الاستجابة وتوفير الحاجات الإنسانية الملحة للشعب السوري. لكن إذا اعتبرناها غير مقصودة، هنا أود أن أطرح سؤالين أساسيين. السؤال الأول: لماذا اليوم لا تسمح للجهات الإنسانية بالوصول إلى الحالات الاستثنائية، أقصد الحالات التي استثناها هذا القانون في سوريا، والتي من المفروض أن تكون متاحة بموجب الإجراءات القسرية الأحادية المطبقة على سوريا؟ السؤال الثاني: لماذا تم رفع هذه العقوبات عن المناطق التي تسيطر عليها جهات مشبوهة ومتطرفة هي أصلاً كانت سبب رئيسي فيما يعاني منه الشعب السوري اليوم؟ إن الأزمة الحالية التي شملت كل أنحاء سوريا قد أضرت بشدة بالاقتصاد. الناتج المحلي الإجمالي انخفض إلى ما يقارب الثلث قبل الحرب، وما يقارب نصف السوريين في سن العمل باتوا عاطلين عن العمل. قيمة العملة السورية تدهورت بشكل مخيف، ارتفعت أسعار المواد الغذائية عشرات الأضعاف، مما يسبب انعدام الأمن الغذائي لعدد كبير من السكان. تخيلوا سوريا تنتج اليوم من المحصول الاستراتيجي القمح الذي كانت تنتجه في الشمال السوري، الآن تنتج ما نسبته 15% فقط من إنتاج هذا المحصول قبل خسارة هذه المناطق. هذه المناطق نفسها التي تخضع الآن لقوات مدعومة من أمريكا، بينما في الوقت نفسه يعاني الشعب السوري يومياً في سبيل تأمين الخبز، مع الأخذ بعين الاعتبار أن دولتي حتى الآن تدعم الخبز وتوفره بالسعر المدعوم للمواطنين. طبعاً أنا لا أريد أن أقلل من أهمية الدور الذي يلعبه النزاع في التسبب بهذا الوضع، لكني أؤكد أن الإجراءات القسرية لم تسهم إلا في تفاقم هذا الوضع الإنساني. الشعب السوري بات يعاني نتيجة وضع، هذا الوضع تحول إلى نزاع أصبح دولي وعلى مستوى لا يصدق من التعقيد. كل من يسعى للاستجابة لحقوق الإنسان الأساسية مقيد بسبب بيروقراطية هذا القانون. هناك أيضاً نقطة إضافية بالنسبة لهذا القانون، إن عدم الوضوح في الاستثناءات الإنسانية التي منحها لبعض القطاعات وعفاها من العقوبات قد أدى إلى امتناع البنوك، شركات التأمين، شركات الشحن، وحتى موردو المنتجات الإنسانية عن التعامل مع أي فرد له صلة بسوريا. إن الأثر المثبت الناتج عن المبالغة في الالتزام بالعقوبات يجبر الجهات الإنسانية والاقتصادية على البحث عن آليات تسديد ودفع غير رسمية، مما يؤدي إلى زيادة التكاليف والتأخير وانخفاض مستوى الشفافية، وفي بعض الحالات يمنع الشركات من الاستمرار. أخيراً، إن الحاجة الأكثر إلحاحاً تتمثل في كل القطاعات السورية وليس فقط في قطاع الصحة والتعليم طبعاً كما يزعمون. كل القطاعات الاقتصادية بحاجة إلى متطلبات كالحصول على قطع الغيار للحفاظ على استمرارية المعدات الطبية، إمدادات الطاقة، المياه، وسائل النقل، المعامل. بالنتيجة أستطيع القول أن الأضرار الاقتصادية ألحقت أثر مباشر لا يميز بين الأفراد وطالت حتى أكثرهم استضعافاً. شكراً لإصغائكم وشكراً على الترجمة. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rania. So we are moving now from Syria to Lebanon. I'll ask Professor Laura Al-SAYAH if she's stay online.
Yes, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. So great to see you online. And yeah, we have you from Doha actually.
Yes, true. Exactly.
Yeah. So we are very, we are looking forward to hear your thoughts related to this subject. Please, Professor Laura.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And I much appreciate my presence in this conference. Dr. CABA-MARIA, thank you so much for the invite. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was more or less expected for the economic crisis in Lebanon to explode, actually paying for accumulation of public debt, monetary policy, corruption, regional influence, including the war, especially in Iraq and Syria, and a set of, let's say, more or less indirect sanctions. My talk will recapitulate the major economic events that happened in Lebanon that, in my humble opinion, are direct factors for not only dismantling the economic structure, but also dismantling what remains from the three most important institutions of the country: the judiciary, country, education, and security. And one of the major economic pillars, let's say the banking sector too. Post-civil war in Lebanon resulted in an increase, a massive increase of foreign capital inflows, particularly based on remittances. And later on, inflows came after the crisis of 2008 crisis, as capital inflows sought actually more or less a safe refuge. And this provided a speedy dollarization of the economy after a depreciation of the Lebanese lira late 1980s and early 1990s. And the United States and the US dollars became one commonly used currency in the country. So facing high inflation, high dollarization, the monetary policy aimed at pegging the Lebanese lira to the US dollars. Despite this policy, dollarization rate did not remarkably decline, and the monetary policy drained actually the international reserves that the Banque du Liban, or the Central Bank of Lebanon, was holding. Furthermore, foreign banknotes in circulation increased, and the US dollars was commonly used for purchases, loans, and deposits, what will at a later stage create a massive crisis that we're going through right now. So the rate of deposits denominated in US dollars kept increasing since 2016, and it was partly motivated by higher interest rates on US dollars deposits, motivating depositors actually to convert their deposits from the Lebanese lira, or the Lebanese national currency, to US dollars. By March 2022, for example, deposits in foreign currencies stood at around 77% of total deposits in the national banks. After the crisis exploded in mid-2019, the Banque du Liban, or the central bank decisions, instead of trying to find a solution to the crisis or reducing its impact, actually fueled the crisis itself. And it was one of the major problems where the Central Bank of Lebanon actually had a negative role in, instead of having a healthy role in facing the crisis, or not working in terms of worsening the situation. For example, the central bank took different decisions that at some point increased massively the liquidity and allowed the depositors and the national agents in attacking the national currency, which led at a later stage to a massive devaluation of the national currency. Second, access to deposits was massively restricted, and depositors were not and are not still able to access their own money in foreign currencies, but also they are facing increasing restrictions in accessing their deposits in Lebanese lira. At least 4 exchange rates are being practiced. The market exchange rate is actually defined by an unknown source, that is a mobile application. It was also noted that exchange agents and bureaus decided to refuse accepting all the US dollars banknotes unless you will be discounted. So if you give them a $100 banknote, they will give you the equivalent of $90 or $80 or so. Inflation has increased due to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. This is an additional increase of inflation, which is intensifying actually the question and the risks of food security. And supply of basic goods such as medicaments, medical supplies, fuel, and bread are being immediately and drastically impacted by the dollarization and the crisis. So for the moment, the crisis, the economic and political crisis in Lebanon showed that despite the high inflation, let's say weirdly or surprisingly, households, Lebanese households, or a major percentage of them are being able to cope with the economic crisis for several reasons. Members of households are receiving remittances, even though now remittances sent to Lebanon are being with lower amounts, because now lower amounts allow a household to survive with the inflation and with the exchange rate. Other employees are getting paid in US dollars. The private sector employees are being paid at least partly in US dollars. Other employees are seeing or had the chance to have an adjustment of their salaries in terms of Lebanese pounds and so on. We can also observe a high proliferation of non-governmental organizations who are paying, or that are paying their employees in fresh US dollars, but a lot of questions arise around those non-governmental organizations in terms of their influence and intervention at the social and economic and sometimes at the political level. Different influence are being questioned. The labor market has been even more distorted. We usually have a distorted labor market in Lebanon in terms of structural distortion, but now the situation is even different. For example, for the internal market, NGOs and companies, and especially private companies, are paying very low salaries to the employees, and individuals are accepting any job offered because simply they need money to survive. And they are accepting any job offered regardless to their education and regardless to their expertise or experience. On the other hand, on the international market, and in large contradiction to the Lebanese diaspora legacy, a high percentage of Lebanese employees are abroad, are seeing their salaries becoming very low, and they are being offered jobs and salaries that usually the Lebanese diaspora would never accept in ordinary or normal cases. So I believe at this level, we will have two deep impacts. First, the remittances inflows that are or used to be a solid pillar of the Lebanese economy will definitely decline as the sources are shrinking in terms of amount of foreign incomes. And two, this will have impacts on the national education. Students will seek jobs that will provide them with an immediate income, regardless to the different other benefits, for example, the social security, the different motives to have a solid career, to invest in themselves, etc. 5, the crisis and dollarization mostly impacted the public administration at all levels. Public employees and teachers, the Lebanese university lecturers and employees, and the judiciary system, and also the military are basically the only ones who are still getting paid in the Lebanese pounds at the original level. So basically, what they are getting are equivalent to nothing in US dollars. For example, this will actually directly impact daily functioning of the state and thus compromising the survival of the minimum that has remained of the state. Army members, for instance, in an unofficial approval, are now allowed to have a second job, which was totally unacceptable before the crisis. And they have very flexible schedules. Long-term sequels will be also observed on the educational sector. Qualified personnel, or those who have had the chance to leave the country already did, or found another job that were better paid, etc., definitely abandoned the sector. Hybrid forms of teaching are being adopted, as employees, teachers, and parents are not being able to pay for the cost or the transportation cost. On the demand side, having to pay or to face high inflation or to pay different bills in US dollars households are not being able to provide their kids with internet, and the internet is not always there or is not always functioning, and additional phones or tablets are not definitely available for the households. So massive dollarization is also, in my opinion, leading to a social restructuring of the Lebanese society. And the social restructuring is based more or less on the amount an individual is getting paid in US dollars, and it's not based on other educational or social standard, the classical ones, let's say. The monetary policy not only lost its efficiency, but also led to a total anarchy on the market. The banking sector lost its most valuable asset, trust. And food security is also questioned in the current international context. And those are only to mention a few consequences of the crisis we're going through in Lebanon. For the moment, unfortunately, there are no perspectives in the horizon. The country will keep lagging due to lack of political will, permanent regional monetary and non-monetary conflict, but also the persistent tension over borders delimitation and the gas prospection. So the crisis in itself is very severe, but in my opinion, the institutional damage it is generating in an originally fragile country is very deep. Not to mention the other messes that we might suffer as Lebanese in the context of the world changing context. So I hope I did not. So thank you for your attention. And again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Professor Laura Al-Sayah. She is from the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. We hope that you are staying with us until the end of the session and maybe until the end of the whole conference. Now, maybe Professor Mohsen Abdullahi from Shahid Beheshti University will conclude also our panel. Professor, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President. Before starting, I would like to appreciate the Middle East Political and Economic Institute and its president, Mr. Flavius CABA-MARIA. Also, my gratitude to Iran Embassy in Romania and His Excellency, Professor Sadat Meidani for supporting this conference. Due to the shortage of time, I summarize what I prepared to say in 10 minutes. Talking about sands and dust storms in a European city, and especially in a rainy day, would be unbelievable. But it is a real aspect of life in the many cities of MENA region. Interesting to let you know that 3 days before I leave Tehran to Romania, Iranian government forced to declare holiday just by dusty pollution weather. What is dust and sandstorms? Dust refers to the very small and light particles of slight clay or sand move long distance by wind erosion and desertification by the wind. When the wind blows slowly and mildly, there is no sign of movement, but when the power of the wind reaches to the threshold, the particles begin to vibrate. By the increase in the speed of the wind, some particles are removed from the surface and pushed into the airflow. The little soft dust particles can be moved up to 6 kilometers in height and 6,000 kilometers away. If it's possible to, we should go fast, please. At the first look, it seems that the dust storms is a regional problem of the Middle East and North Africa. However, it has been revealed that this problem is not limited to this area. It is a part of the general desertification process occurring in many areas of the world. Moreover, the borderless transboundary nature of the sand and dust storms make it a global problematic. Dust storms are capable of transporting sediment over thousands of kilometers. In this line, the last report of the UN Secretary General in 2021 to General Assembly declares that while 45 countries are the sands and dust storm sources area, more than 151 countries are affected directly by dust storms. A map in this presentation, if you find it, kind to find it. Previous slide, please. You can see what was the reality of the world 40 years ago. The blue spot was the dusty part of the world during 1981, during 2010. But right now you can see that the vast part of the world are polluted by dust storms. This is the reality of this environmental phenomenon. February 2021 dust storms is a good example. In this case, dust from the Sahara arrived in Europe in two major events, causing air quality to deteriorate from the Mediterranean coast across much of Central Europe as far as Scandinavia, and depositing several million tons of material. Therefore, it can be concluded that the dust storm is a global problem. My studies for this conference showed me that in comparison of 12 years ago, when Islamic Republic of Iran initiated a regional ministerial meeting for encouraging its neighbors to cooperate for combating dust storms, now the MENA region and even the world are integrated in this problem. Nobody can deny the role of the United Nations in this regard. The United Nations General Assembly not only recognized this phenomenon as an issue of international concern and recognized it as a serious challenge to achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, but also established that regional and international bodies for coordinating states' efforts to tackle this borderless phenomenon. The United Nations Coalition for Combating Dust and Sandstorms, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, and finally, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia are among these institutions. Now the activities of these bodies prepare states for participation in further norm making and integrated them into the existing and newborn international arrangements for combating sand and dust storms. However, such integration should not mislead us from the black capacity of dust storm for regional disintegrations. Let me give you two examples from the Middle East. First, Turkey's mega gap project over the Euphrates and Tigris transboundary rivers have created new hotspots and sand and dust storms in Iraq, Syria, and probably Iran as downstream states. Southeastern Anatolian project, so-called GAP project, is a water resource project which includes construction. If you please kindly bring the map, another, no, down, please. Yeah, this. Construction of 22 dams and 19 power plants on these two rivers. And most recent one, AL-Sham Dam, which many states, including Iran, Iraq, and Syria, protested it. Also, another case is Afghanistan damming on transboundary river, in particular, Kamal Khan Dam on Helmand River, which flows to Iran and internationally important wetlands, has escalated tension between two states over the international watershed of Hamun wetland. If you bring final slide, thank you. This is Helmand or Hirmand River, which originated from the north of Afghanistan and flows to international wetland of Hamun. It is interesting to know that these wetlands are 3 separate lakes. And interesting to know that 2 lakes are in the territory of Afghanistan. And the big lake, you can see Hamun, Hirmand, Hamun Saberi, and Hamun Puzak. The third one, Hamun Hirmand, is located in Iran territories. Damming on this river here, Kamal Khan, located here, Kamal Khan Dam, led the shortage of the water and drought of the Hamun wetlands. And it escalated tension between 2 countries. As a final conclusion, I should say if environmental issues have capacity for integrating states regionally or internationally, they have also enough potential for making disputes and so disintegrations. Therefore, there is no choice but to recognize the environmental problems as an issue of international concern and cooperating to tackle them globally, even if today we couldn't feel them personally. This is why international lawyers call environmental law as solidarity law. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Abdullahi.